Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. My name is Lizzie Hanks, and I'm a PhD student in applied linguistics at Northern Arizona University. Today, my presentation is about the nursery we and some research I've been doing. It is titled Building Rapport Through Pronouns, the Nursery We and Teacher-Student Interactions. So we'll start with the background and then go into part one and part two of the study, followed by the conclusion with implications and future directions. So starting with background, rapport is an overall feeling between two people encompassing a mutual, trusting, and pro-social bond. And it's widely believed that good rapport between an instructor and student can be conducive to student learning. And this is because it encourages interaction, can reduce student anxiety, builds a comfortable learning environment, bolsters student attentiveness, increases student enjoyment, among other things. Some researchers have mentioned that teacher talk can be a tool to help build rapport, and talk encompasses anything the teacher says in the classroom, and it can include word choice, syntax, formulaic expressions, speed, volume, intonation, facial expressions, body language, and pronouns. And the focus of this presentation is on this element of teacher talk, pronouns, and how well it can build rapport. So let's first start with we and its many functions. So many times we think that we, especially compared to other languages, is relatively simple and straightforward, but actually many researchers have pulled apart some different functions of we, and we won't go through all of these right now. This is just to illustrate that there are a lot of different functions of we in the English language. Specifically, this presentation focuses on the nursery we, which is when we functions as a second person pronoun. So for example, a teacher in class might say, let's keep working on our essays, but in reality, they actually mean you should keep working on your essays. That is an example of the nursery we. Some researchers have discussed the nursery we and how it may be perceived by students. They say it could be coaxing, condescending, encouraging, friendly, polite, or sarcastic. But as you can guess, this is a bit problematic because these words have completely different feelings. We have some positive perceptions here, but also some indications that the nursery we might come off negatively. So if the nursery we is condescending or sarcastic, or students perceive it as so, we would probably want to avoid it in our classrooms. So I've split my study into two parts, and the first part is looking at frequency. So in instructor-student exchanges, how often do college-level instructors use the nursery we relative to other functions of we and the pronoun you? As well as how often do college students use the nursery we? That's part one. And then part two, if it turns out that the nursery we is relatively frequent, I'm interested in looking at how students perceive it in terms of being likable, helpful, encouraging, coaxing, sarcastic, and condescending. And as you may remember, these are some of the words that previous researchers have used to describe use of the nursery we. So let's start with part one, which is frequency. I used corpus to analyze frequency, the TOEFL 2000 spoken and written academic language corpus, or T2K SWAL. I specifically looked at the office hour visits portion of the corpus because I postulated that this is more interactive, so it would be easier to actually examine the frequency of use for instructors' language and the frequency of use for students' language as well. And this portion of the corpus had about 50,000 tokens with 11 different files. And I manually tagged functions of we as well as its other forms of us, our, and ourselves. And I tagged them by function. The first function, of course, is nursery we, which is when the we functions as a second person pronoun. For example, here's an example from the corpus. All right, we want to stay away from the negative, whereas really the instructor was saying you want to stay away from the negative. I looked at the reporting we, which is when we functions as a third person pronoun. So for example, we think we're the best. And in this case, the instructor was talking about a historical event and describing how other people, they thought about themselves. The editorial we, which is when we functions as a first person singular pronoun or I. So, okay, we'll put 8 history 380 there, when really the instructor is saying I'll put it down because they're planning the schedule for the students. Last, of course, is the prototypical we, which is when we is used to refer to the speaker and others, which is what we traditionally think of as the use of we. So why don't we meet at 9 o'clock, as in why don't you and I meet at 9 o'clock? However, there were some uses of you that were ambiguous. For example, this one, the instructor cut themselves off at the end, so it was impossible to determine what use of we it was. And in this case, it was tagged as an ambiguous we. Here are our results. These are normed counts. So we can see prototypical we, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the most common for both instructors and students. This dark gray represents the instructor's language and the light gray represents students' language. And we can see if we look at the non-prototypical functions that the nursery we does come up next. And interestingly, it's relatively frequent in the instructor's language, but not so much. It's really rare, it looks like, in the student's language. We can also see, of course, there are uses of these other we's as well as the ambiguous we, which is about even for instructors and students. Here are some raw counts just so you can see that there is variation, but again, the nursery we appears to be much more common in the instructor's language here. So looking more closely at the corpus and uses of the nursery we from instructors, I found that oftentimes the nursery we is used in directives. For example, we would have to, just solve for these two when really the instructor is giving the student a direction, like, hey, you have to solve for these two in order to complete this math problem. And it also appeared a lot in representatives, specifically about things that maybe the instructor had previously mentioned to the student and the student did not remember. So for example, the instructor says here, since we read about it, but really since you read about it and remember, you should probably remember this, hint, hint. So those seems to be two patterns that were arising pretty frequently with the instructor's use of the nursery we. Let's look at the students' use of the nursery we here. You can see, again, it's really infrequent with the nursery we. And interestingly, there were only a couple times that a student used the nursery we. And in fact, each time that the student used the nursery we, the instructor would correct them or somehow call them out for using the nursery we. So for example, in this exchange, the student says, we can do that change in my schedule. Specifically, the student was telling the instructor to make a change in their schedule or in their plan. And the instructor says, I can do it. Like, okay, well, it's not we, I'm really the one who's going to do it. So this kind of hints at the possibility that instructors and students are aware of these rules or felicity conditions we have for use of the nursery we, because they are calling students out on it. Of course, that's something that requires further study. So seeing that the nursery we is relatively common in language, I wanted to continue by looking at student perceptions. And I did this through a survey and a focus group. So the survey had 80 students, 80 participants, and the focus group had 5 participants, and these were all undergraduate college students. For the sake of time, I can't go into much detail about the results from the focus group, but they did overall support results from the survey. The survey was conducted in Qualtrics and they had 10 questions each, and the question included first a short conversation between an instructor and a student followed by an opportunity for students to rank how they perceived the instructor to be in this conversation. So I will give you in a second more details about what exactly was included in those conversations. But right now, let's look at the question types. We had 7 target questions. And so those were randomly assigned between experimental and control. So participants saw about 4 experimental questions and about 3 control questions, or they saw 3 experimental questions and about 4 control questions. And there were 3 distractor questions that were the same for each participant, and those were just intermixed within the target questions. The questions were based off of corpus data from part 1 of the study, but I also included some extra controls in order to control for a couple things, including the number of turns. So each question included a conversation that had a student turn, followed by an instructor turn, followed by, again, by a student turn. So there was just 3 turns each time. There also were controls for sentence type. So the instructor's turn always included a statement rather than a question. And that's because some researchers have mentioned that questions, including the nursery week, could be perceived differently than statements, as well as the content was controlled for. So the instructor's turn always shared some information. And then lastly, of course, the questions were controlled for the use of pronouns. The instructor's turn always included only one use of either the nursery we or the pronoun you. After reading the conversation, participants ranked the instructors in terms of being these features: likable, helpful, encouraging, coaxing, sarcastic, and condescending. So here's an example. We have the turn, the exchange at the beginning. The student says, well, what if I use this function instead? The professor says, so then we're going to get 0. But this is an example of the nursery we. Really, the professor saying, so then you're going to get 0. And the student responds, 0, okay. And then down here at the bottom, the participant ranks the instructor, or the professor in this case, between strongly disagree and agree for all of these characteristics. So looking at these results from the survey, we have these features that some are positive and some are negative. So they could potentially be grouped into these 2 constructs of positive versus negative. So in order to decide whether I should conduct the data analysis based on these 2 larger constructs, I conducted Spearman's row correlations between each characteristic. And these are the correlations that came up with a moderate correlation, at least. And you can see, yes, there are some moderate correlations here. However, they wouldn't be strong enough to argue that likable and helpful, for example, represent the same construct. So I went through and did the analysis with these characteristics analyzed separately from each other. And I used paired sample t-tests and Wilcoxon tests using the means of participants' positive or of their ratings for each characteristic. And here are the results. Let's make it a little easier to see. Now you can see that these first 4 characteristics, likable, helpful, encouraging, and coaxing, all had significant results, and they had small effect sizes. And these results all showed that the nursery we was perceived to a greater extent as likable, helpful, encouraging, and coaxing than the pronoun you. So in all these cases, nursery we had a higher rating than you. So into our conclusion, in summary, we can see that the most common non-prototypical use of we in instructor-student interactions is the nursery we. And that is particularly true for the instructor's language. Second, students perceive it as slightly more likable, helpful, encouraging, and coaxing than the pronoun you. And last, students do not perceive it as more sarcastic nor condescending than the pronoun you. So these have some implications for us. First of all, it shows that the nursery we can boost solidarity, which ultimately builds rapport because students perceive it as these positive things, likable, helpful, encouraging. Um, However, the scope of this study was, is limited, of course. So we can only apply this to a certain number of cases. And first, the nursery we should be used only with students in order to have this positive effect. So that we saw in the corpus that when students use it with someone of a higher rank, for example, their instructors, it wasn't perceived as well, we can guess, because the instructor always responded negatively or corrected them. So for our use in the classroom, we should take care to use the nursery we only with students based on this data. The second is that we should probably use the nursery we only occasionally. In our frequency results, the nursery we did appear relatively frequently compared to other non-prototypical uses of the we, but still compared to you, we see a stark difference. So the nursery we was used a mean of about 2 times and you was used about 37 times by instructors. So as instructors, we could think about using the nursery we around once for every 20 times we use you. And last, based on this data and the scope of this research, we should be using the nursery we probably more often in conversations than in monologic lectures. And of course, this is an area of future research that's necessary as well. But we do see Rounds, for example, in 1987 has suggested that perhaps the nursery we could be condescending in these monologic lectures. So further research, of course, there are many future directions here. So first of all, and I think the most pressing concern here is looking into this feature in second language classrooms. So the study was examining college classrooms, and although participation from second language speakers was not was encouraged, we didn't get any responses from the survey about this. However, in the focus group, we did have one English second language speaker, and this speaker said that perhaps it could be confusing for people who are learning English for the first time, who are beginners. So this is the most pressing concern, I believe, for future research, is to look into how language learners perceive use of the nursery we, and whether it's confusing or whether they are also able to reap these benefits of a boost in rapport. Second, I would definitely be interested in looking at monologic versus dialogic discourse and how the perceptions as well as how the frequency of the nursery we could be different. Also, a written versus spoken component of the nursery we is an interesting area of future research. In our focus group, one participant mentioned that perhaps using the nursery we on written comments on an essay would be condescending compared to spoken comments. And also, this is something that can be addressed as a limitation of this study because I was looking at spoken language. However, the form was written, and that was a help in limiting some confounding variables, of course, but we do need some more research about how spoken language is perceived. And then last area of future research could be instructor perceptions. So we saw in the corpus data some interesting things going on with how the instructors responded to use of the nursery we. And we also see that it's used fairly commonly and that some instructors use it more than others. And perhaps this indicates that they're using it because they are aware that it serves a certain purpose or because they hope it serves a certain purpose. So in the future, looking into instructor perceptions of the nursery we would be a fruitful area as well, I believe. Here are the references used. And thank you again so much for attending this presentation. And I would love to take any questions you may have.